Us today. My name is Nagaraj Adve, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Teachers Against Climate Crisis. This is a group that was set up last year to promote engagement around the climate crisis, particularly among teachers and students, college teachers and students, and so on, both engagement and understanding. And this is the 8th talk in our series. We had talks in colleges before the lockdown, but after the lockdown, we've been having these talks online. It's 6th talk online. And today's talk is entitled Green Growth and the Right to Energy in India. So in a sense, it seeks to tackle the growing carbon dioxide emissions, which in 2018 had reached about 38 billion tons in that year. And one way in which people have sought to tackle that or address it is through fiscal measures, basically a charge on the carbon content of fossil fuels to discourage their use and hopefully promote a shift to cleaner sources of energy. So this is usually levied on a ton of either carbon or more carbon, commonly on carbon dioxide. So just to clarify how that works, basically, say if you take a ton of Indian coal, 1,000, because it has a lot of fly ash, there's roughly about 2.4 tons of carbon dioxide because of the relative molecular weight of carbon and oxygen in carbon dioxide. So if one just does the maths, it's roughly about over 400 kgs of coal emits 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So if one were to be imposing a tax on, say, a ton of carbon dioxide, it implies that you're imposing a tax, say, on 400 kgs of Indian coal. So thereby, if it were, say, oil and gas, it would be different. And one can do similar calculations for oil or for gas, depending on their carbon content, or depending on the carbon that's embodied in any product and so on, right? The idea, the practice of a carbon tax goes back actually exactly 30 years. Some of these Scandinavian countries were the first to impose a tax. Finland was the first to do so in 1990, followed by Norway and Sweden in 1991, and then by Denmark. And Sweden still to date has the highest carbon tax in the world. I was actually looking at carbon taxes earlier today and realized something I didn't know, in fact, that either the rate is either too low or where it is high, like in the case of Sweden, it covers a very small volume of emissions. So for instance, Sweden's tax is high, but its emissions are just about 45 to 50 million tons of carbon dioxide. On the other hand, Japan's has a carbon tax, which covers roughly 1 billion tons of their carbon dioxide emissions out of an annual volume of, say, 1.3 billion tons. However, their tax is merely $3 per ton of carbon dioxide. So no country really combines both, except perhaps France to a degree. So let's see actually what Rohit has to offer for us today for India. So Rohit today will present an energy policy with equity for India, in which he refers to a carbon tax. But the broad purpose in a sense is to catalyze or trigger a change in the energy mix. And let's just he'll present how that might be calculated, how the revenues will be distributed, etc. And like I was saying, this presentation is called Green Growth and the Right to Energy in India, which I think is extremely important. Rohit teaches at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University and is the author of It's Not Over, Structural Drivers of the Global Economic Crisis, published by OEP in 2013. He's also the co-author with another member of our teachers group, along with Shouvik Chakravorty, of a paper that was published in March in Energy Policy, which is called Green Growth and the Right to Energy in India. So the format is, as it's been, Rohit will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be open out for questions, your comments, thoughts, discussions. You could also type in any of that in the chat box. If you wish to also speak up and sort of share your thoughts, if you prefer that, that's also possible. You just you can unmute yourself and speak up. So Rohit, why don't you take over, you have the floor, and like you requested, I'll let you know after half an hour. You can speak 40 minutes. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Naga, and thank you, Vandana, also in particular, because otherwise we wouldn't have managed to do a Zoom talk without a break at 40 minutes. So let me get straight to, so before I start, let me add a rider that I'm very new to this field. My specialization actually is not environmental economics. It's more recently that I've acquired some bit of expertise in it. So if there are any mistakes, I'll blame Shouvik for it because he's really an expert. Sorry, Shouvik, for that. I'll start the presentation. I'll have that as the window, and then when we end, then the video would be back in terms of questions and answers. Let me just share the. So I hope it's visible to everybody in full screen. If anybody can confirm, then I can start.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
All right. Okay. So, and let me also move this. Just a second. Sorry, it's right in the middle of. Okay. So this is a paper that we've written on the issue of carbon tax, and this, in a way, also gels well with the debate that we've been wanting to have, although I'm no expert on that, but between the degrowth and the green growth are not really a debate, but also looking at from within the left perspective of how do we deal with the climate crisis. But this particular paper is more on carbon tax than on green growth in particular, although a bit of it is also on that. This is a paper which I've just mentioned, and as did Naga, which came out in Energy Policy. It's a co-authored paper. I am presenting it. Shouvik has also joined. So when we have the question answer session, he'll also be able to join and respond. So it has normally been said that sustainability of growth or as far as emissions are concerned, it's essentially a problem of the North, at least for some time within the left, if I may say so, in the global South. Environment was definitely not on a priority agenda of its political movement or in terms of formulating its political demands. It was more driven by employment, it was more driven by growth, actually, which is redistributive, so on and so forth. Definitely not environment. As of late things have changed, but it was not so. And we believe that that is something which needs to change, which I'll come to just in a moment. And what we propose here is actually trying to address both the issues of inequality as well as environmental sustainability as two issues which can be brought together in the form of a policy. And that's the alternative growth trajectory that we are essentially proposing here, which answers this question that they can both be done simultaneously. You can have an economic growth which is fundamentally sustainable. So employment and all of that becomes a core of that kind of development trajectory. The essence, essentially, is normally we had that, it's our problem, it's the problem of the North. But if you look at the effects of it, which is already being in terms of the cyclones, in terms of the locust scare that we had, and many other problems that we are facing, in particular in the coastal regions today, it's primarily in the global South which the effects of it are felt and are felt way before it would be felt anywhere else, because of the fact that we live in the tropical region of the world, and where the altitudes are low and the temperatures are already very high. So the point is not that it's only the problem of the North, it is definitely as much a problem of the South, and hence a response also has to come from the South as well. The question that is normally made is that we have not contributed enough, and it's basically the contribution has come from the global North, so it is their responsibility to take care of this, the mess that they have created. It's not so much as ours, and hence the negotiations, even on carbon trading, are essentially around that. We believe that there's a flaw in that argument. Because yes, it is true that the stock of emissions have come from the global North since Industrial Revolution. At the same time, if you look at the 80s onwards, when the global South, a significant number of countries become a part of the global growth model, there is a significant proportion of the flows which comes from these emerging market economies in absolute terms, definitely. Not necessarily in per capita terms, but then when you have per capita terms, it's not really a very feasible feasible way of looking at things, because of the simple reason that when let's say the crisis strikes, it's not going to strike per capita. It basically takes away an entire population, attacks let's say the entire region. It does not attack anybody individually, and the density of the population that we have, the global south is going to suffer more. So this hiding behind low per capita emissions is something that we believe is counterproductive. Last but not the least is that we have an abundance of natural resources in the tropics, and hence we should actually be investing in developing indigenous technologies, which can then give us a competitive advantage in the world. So what we do in this paper is we propose an energy policy with equity, which changes the energy mix, as Naga said, of the Indian economy towards greener forms of energy per unit of, let's say, GDP, as well as guarantees universal access to energy, which is thus generated to the entire population of this country. Tall claims, but let me show you that, that this can be done. So the presentation is divided in 4 parts. I'll start with some basic economics of it, because Naga had told me to make it in a way that that one can have debate around the economics of it. So I'll spend some time on that, then the features of our proposal, then how have we done it, and then the results. So that's the structure of the presentation. Let me start with the first part. Before I go into the entire presentation, this is something that I wanted to show to all of you. This is basically the share in carbon footprint of India's population. And this is based on the NSS survey, which does a survey on the consumption expenditure of households in the country. And what you see, this is an underestimate because of the simple fact that the richest 10% that is mentioned here are not the Ambanis, because they are not the ones who are surveyed. So the people who are surveyed, within them, those who are the richest 10%, they contribute 1/4 of the total carbon footprint in India. And you can see the poorest 10% contribute half their proportion in population. So what you see here is what is called a climate injustice funnel.
Rohit, sorry to interrupt you. I think your share screen is not moving.
Sorry?
I can only see your first slide, your cover slide.
Oh, it's not moving?
No, it doesn't seem to be, no.
Uh-oh. Can you give me a second?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Why not give it to someone else who can share it or something?
No. It's something which...
sorry, you'll figure it out.
Sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. But it's the share window. Just give me a second. I'll do it again. I mean, not the presentation, just the sharing of the screen. And just let me know if it shows this time.
Yeah, you're now on structure.
Now.
Yeah, so the first bit I've already said. So this is the structure of, can you see it now?
You can see structure of the presentation, yeah.
Yes. So I'll just move one and you can see if it's moving. Is it moving now?
Yeah, yes, it is, yes.
Yeah, so I was on this screen, basically, just a second. Basically trying to show to you that if you look at the share in carbon footprint of India's population, I've just mentioned that the top 10% of the population contributes 1/4 of the total carbon footprint in the country. And as I said, this is not really the richest 10%. So this funnel would actually be more like a funnel if you were to genuinely include the richest 10% like the Ambanis and the Adanis in this funnel. They are not included. And yet you see such a huge disparity in terms of the footprint that each decile of the population contributes. So this is, keep this at in the background, because this is what represents the inequality in carbon emissions in a country such as ours. And this is pretty much the case anywhere in the world, but this is particularly, the data is essentially for India, which we have presented in the paper. This is a slide which I want to spend a couple of minutes on, which is essentially to show to you the economics behind behind carbon emissions and how the response from different schools of thought in economics are essentially presented. So what you see here, if you give me some time to explain, what you have in the axis below is basically carbon emissions, which you see on the x-axis. And on the y, you basically have what is called the marginal benefit. So every extra unit of carbon that you emit, what is the benefit that you get, marginal benefit that you get out of that? So look at it from the perspective of firms which are producing a good, which uses carbon or emits carbon in the process. So as you keep on increasing your production, every additional unit of carbon, because of what economists call that every additional unit is less productive than the previous one, marginally, is what gives me a line like that. So if I were to have a situation where there is no price on carbon at all, which means that I will basically be using this much carbon because I don't have to pay any price whatsoever. So I'll pollute to the maximum, beyond which there's no more production possible. So I basically stop here. I don't know if you can see the mouse there, but basically this is the point at which is,
yeah, we can.
Can you see it, Naga? When
Yeah, we can, yeah, we can, yes.
Yeah. So this S that you see there is essentially the maximum amount of carbon with this given technology that that particular firm and hence the economy would be emitting at a point in time if there are no prices charged on carbon. You forget about the dotted line for the moment. The way this debate, at least within the green growth school has been, is how do you decrease the emissions? There are two ways in which you can decrease it purely from the demand side. One is you cap the emissions, and that's a debate that, I mean, carbon trading is essentially a part of that, although it hasn't been successful, that you cap the total emissions itself. So you basically create a vertical line here, whatever may be the limit of that, which this CD represents here, and you say that beyond this, no more carbon can be emitted, and the way you do it is by issuing permits by the government, that this is the amount of carbon permit that you have. You buy it from the government or from individuals if you distribute it across individuals, which is also a proposal which has come from various people. That's basically a way of limiting carbon emissions where you put a cap on how much you can emit. In which case, what it does is you literally just stop the emissions there. The other possibility is that you essentially put a tax on emission itself, in which case you don't restrict the quantity, but you restrict or you put a price to carbon. So let's say if the tax were to be this, if you go below this, then you're essentially paying more than the benefit you're getting. So basically then you are emitting this much because the market gives you the signal only to emit that much. So taxes are a way of substituting for the cap. They're basically intersubstitutable in terms of a strategy. But a more interesting thing is basically to shift this curve itself inwards. Now that can be done in two different ways. One is the degrowth school, which says that the emissions itself, if your GDP decreases or the rate of growth of GDP decreases, then you're essentially moving this curve inwards. There is not enough production taking place, and hence you have lower emissions because the GDP itself, the base itself is shifting down. The other possibility is within the green growth school is that you change the energy mix of the same GDP, let's say, in which case, even though the GDP is being produced, but it is being produced by through greener forms of energy. So that's the shift that you see changing the energy mix there. What we are proposing, you combine the two policies, you change the energy mix and put a tax. both of which is going to bring the carbon emissions down from CS to the C bar, which is what the target should be of this policy. I'm sorry I've spent a little too much of a time on this, but rest of the slides would be easier to go through. What are the features of the proposal that we are making? One is from the supply side. So there are three ways in which this energy transition can be made. Number one is moving towards lower carbon emitting fossil fuels. And the reason why we say so is that you can't abruptly just close the fossil fuel industry, both because of employment, also because of the political acceptance of that. And hence you need to move away from fossil fuels at a rate which can be sustained politically and economically. And for that you move towards CNG as Delhi has done, and other forms of lower carbon emitting fossil fuels. The second, on which India is very bad, is increasing the efficiency of energy usage. I mean, for example, many of the official buildings that you see, they're not really insulated enough, well enough, in which case a lot of energy gets wasted. So things like those can be spent money can be spent on them. And last, and the most important, is increased investment in greener forms of energy, so that eventually we move away from fossil fuels altogether. Now, this has been estimated by Shouvik and Robert Pollin in their paper, that if you do this entire thing, this would require about an expenditure of 1.5% of your GDP. Currently, we spend about 0.6% on green, on environment-related policy over a period of 20 years. So 2 decades, you'll have to consistently follow this development model to be able to make that transition that I was just talking about, with this expenditure of 1.5%. So I'll come back to this number just in a bit. On the demand side, which is what we are contributing in this paper, is that the emissions can be controlled, as I said, either by putting a quantity restriction, which is a carbon cap, or indirectly by putting a price to it and leaving the quantity open, which is the carbon tax. And we are taking the latter route because most of the countries in the global south are still dealing with levels of employment, dealing with issues of development. So it may not be fair to impose a carbon cap straight away. Instead, leave the carbon emission slightly flexible and increase the prices and the carbon emission to adjust to it. The problem with carbon tax or with carbon cap is that it's extremely regressive. And by regressive, one means is that the tax burden falls more on the poor for the simple reason that they have, the amount of money that their income that they spend on consumption is much higher. If they're buying the same goods, they're ultimately paying the same tax, exactly the same tax as a rich person. If you buy a toothpaste with a tax imposed on it, you'll both be paying, whether you're rich or poor, paying the same amount of tax. So per unit of your income, you will be paying more, lower the income strata you belong to. And hence economists call it these taxes regressive in nature. So obviously, this is not what we would want. And that's not something which is politically sustainable, or which is just in any sense that you put the burden of adjustment actually on people who are anyway at the receiving end of it. So how do we adjust for that? And that's where our policy comes into the picture, where we are saying that you use this tax to distribute resources in kind to the poorer sections of the population. And that's what I'll spend the rest of the presentation on. This discussion has happened in the global north. It has also been implemented, for example, in British Columbia, or as Naga said, in a few other countries. But in the global south, to our knowledge, at least in India, this discussion has not happened. And hence, the carbon tax in that sense is relatively new in terms of a discussion for our country. The salient features of our proposal, we from the supply side, we raise the energy, the economy's level of energy efficiency. So as I said, we move towards natural gas consumption relative to coal, invest in clean renewables, so on and so forth. And from the demand side, we propose a policy of carbon tax in the initial years of implementation, which can then be switched to a carbon cap later down the line. In terms of equity, as I said, the taxes so generated can then be used as an in-kind transfer. And in particular, we discussed two possibilities. Number one is in the form of free energy up to a certain limit that is given, and that limit I'll define in a bit. And those who are crossing that limit pay the full price of all the units consumed. Those who live in Delhi can immediately relate to it. The Aam Aadmi Party's policy of giving 200 units free electricity to everybody has created a problem because the people who consume more than 200 units of electricity are also getting that 200 units free, which is not really fair and correct and environmentally just or sustainable. Our point is, apart from changing the energy mix of that electricity production itself, you also limit the consumption. I mean, you don't give it free for those who can afford it. So just keep this in mind in terms of what is to come in that the discussion that we have after this. In terms of how we have done it and what we have done it, let me spend some time on this bit. I'm not giving the details of the calculation because it becomes very boring. That's not the purpose of this presentation, to show all those things. Here we are merely giving you a broad overview of what we have done. So you basically have two parts. One is the revenue side, the money that you get as if you impose a tax, and the other is the expenditure side. So you will see both the sides in a moment. From the expenditure side, you essentially have one part of the expenditure which has to go in energy transition, in expenditure on energy transition. So infrastructure around that, which, as I just said, has been calculated as about 1.5% of the GDP every year for 20 years. So all the numbers that we are presenting are annual. So that annual thing has to continue for 20 years. Added to that is the expenditure on transfers in kind, as I said, in the form of free energy, and the second part, which is travel passes. So we are essentially saying that everybody gets a travel pass. It's easy again to relate to in the context of Delhi. So if you have a metro card, it comes with a preloaded amount of a certain amount, which is given by the state to you, so that people are encouraged to use public transport. To some extent, what the Aam Aadmi Party did in Delhi in terms of making public transport free for women across the board, whether it's bus or trains, is something similar to this. But here we are saying a certain limit should be given to everybody, and that limit I'll define just in a moment. So basically, the expenditure side is divided in two parts. One is the expenditure on energy transition, and the other is in terms of transfers in kind. Energy transition has a value for the poor in terms of the carbon emissions, the effects of that when they come down. Then it benefits the poor more, as has been talked about extensively. The people who are at the receiving end are the poor. And transfers in kind are directly compensatory for them because you get these things in hand. So electricity, if it becomes free for you, generated through greener sources, then a certain unit you get for free is something that you immediately are compensated for as a result of taxes. The tax is calculated based on an emission target that the government may have, let's say a C that you want to achieve in all, in total, and is collected upstream, which is where Naga's point was important, that it's not on a commodity that you put a tax. You put the tax on carbon per se. which is what people call as upstream taxation. So wherever carbon enters the economy, so for example, the ports where oil enters, mine heads, oil refineries, you put a tax there itself, and then you don't have to worry about at what extent, in which commodity, how much tax. That's none of your business. You have put the tax at the very source, after which it percolates into taxation in various commodities according to the production of those commodities. So it's a very relatively easy way of implementing taxation, and it's not like coal cess, which is a uniform cess across commodities. This is something different. This is a tax on carbon, so it will affect different commodities differently. Higher the amount of carbon that you have in a commodity, higher would be the price of that, and that I'll show you just in a moment. So you have this as the policy. The carbon tax revenue is what is used for energy transition expenditure and for transfers in kind. So as you can see, in this case, government doesn't have to spend anything from its own coffers. So it doesn't have any fiscal burden at all. So all those who are obsessed with fiscal burden, it's actually not going to have any burden on the state. Instead, you actually have an internal income redistribution happening because the rich are paying for it and the poor are receiving these transfers. So you're basically inverting the funnel that I had shown you at the beginning, that those who are polluting more also contribute more to this program, and those who are at the receiving end of it are the ones who receive the benefits of it. So that's what the essence of this policy is. In terms of results, and that's mostly what the end of the presentation, a little bit discussion around that. So the results are the following. If you look at it from the energy mix side, which is, bringing that graph inside. So per unit of GDP, how much of emission would be made is what, this is not from our paper, this is from Shouvik and Robert Pollin's paper in EPW, which is very interesting. I'd recommend those who are interested in this to take a look at that paper. What they've done is, if I can spend just a couple of minutes on this, is they have taken the IEA's current 2035 policy scenario, that if the current policy of 0.6% of GDP being spent on greening the economy, if you extrapolate that for, and this was written in 2015, so 20 years down the line, then in 2035, this is what you would get. Total energy consumption is 67.7 QBTU, of which renewable energy supply is 1.7. They propose nuclear power policy supply also, and the rest is basically fossil fuels and renewables. If you have such a policy, then the total carbon emissions would be 4.7 billion tons, and which would translate into 3.1 tons per capita. If instead you were to implement this policy, then it will bring down the total energy consumption drastically from 67.7 to 36.8. These are all estimates. Why? Because you increase the renewable energy supply from 1.7 to 5.1, and most importantly, your with energy saving and shift from high to low emissions renewables, you will essentially have a higher possibility of energy saving. So 31.7 Q is what can be used to produce the same GDP in the economy. And it is obvious that if the total consumption, energy consumption, has gone down almost by half, then you would also have total carbon emissions also going down. Which means that the carbon emission itself will fall below the norm that is being set by the IEA in terms of keeping the temperature down by 1.5 degrees, if I'm not mistaken. So this is from the supply side. If you look at it from the demand side, it requires some bit of explanation. I still have some time. So let me spend a little bit of time on this. What we have done is essentially we've taken the commodities that we consume. So all of us are part of this survey. I mean, not everybody is approached for the survey, but those who have been surveyed by the NSS would know that you have a detailed form which has all these commodities in there, and you fill that form. What we have done is we have categorized those commodities in 8 different categories, which is food, clothing, industrial goods, housing, fuel, transport, medical, and miscellaneous services. And from India's input-output, which is essentially how much of fuel, how much of energy goes into production of 1 unit of food, we calculate the carbon content of that particular set of commodity. So as you can see, the highest carbon content is, not surprisingly, in fuel and electricity. It's very high compared to any other commodity that you see here. Food is the lowest, fuel and electricity is the highest, followed by industrial goods and transport. So it is obvious that any commodity which uses fuel and electricity more is going to have a higher rise in terms of prices, and fuel and electricity itself will have the highest hike as a result of this carbon tax, which has an effect in terms of people trying to substitute for other forms, because if electricity becomes more expensive, and you will see it becomes 25 percentage points more expensive, which is a decent jump, as would petrol. It's not just electricity, but fuel, petrol also would become 25% more. So 70 would be around 100. And I know it pinches, but it should pinch. This is the climate injustice quotient, based on which we have taken the cutoff where those who contribute more to emissions in the economy, we create a benchmark which is given by this. So what you have here is the share in carbon footprint versus your share in the population. So 0.53 essentially means that I only contribute half of what I am. So 10% of the population only contributes 5% to the emissions. And look at the top 10%, which is 8 times as high. So the poorest contribute half, and the richest contribute 2.5 times more than their share in the population. So we have created a line here where those who are the 7th decile and below are the ones who are contributing less, and 8th decile and above are contributing more than their share in the population. So we create this as the policy cutoff, where all those who belong to this part of the population, they benefit from this policy, and all those who belong to this side, they pay for that policy. And what is the benchmark? The benchmark is whatever is the level of consumption of the 7th decile, which is the cutoff decile, their energy consumption and their transport expenditure is actually made universal. So that's the access that all these deciles have. So which increases their standard of living and access to energy, which whatever the 7th decile consumes is what everybody's right would be. So 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the bottom 7 deciles would have the same access to energy as the 7th had, free of cost. And that's what we'll do. This is just to show you what percentage is spent on what. And you can see that, that the expenditure here skyrockets. So the bottom 10% spends, this is in US dollars, 137 annually. And the richest almost 9 to 10 times of that, 1294. And you can see that here, I find this the most interesting. This is your flights and your SUVs and whatever have you. This 104 in transport. If you look at food, it's pretty much, because food is a necessity, it's in terms of proportion, obviously a higher proportion in the poorest section of the population. What the tax does is it basically, because each of these commodities are taxed, then each of these commodities show up at a higher price because of this taxation that flows into every commodity based on the amount.
10 minutes. Since you asked me to tell you, 10 minutes.
Yes. I'll be done. I have 2 slides, so should be done. Thank you. Thanks, Naga. So I was just saying that, so each of these deciles then they have to then pay more because there has been a tax across these commodities. And I said that nobody needs to calculate these taxes individually on commodities. It just flows through because the cost, the most important commodity that is used in production of each of these, the price of that has increased. So obviously it will get passed on in terms of prices across all commodities. What does this policy do? It tries to, or at least that's what we think it is trying to do. We'll probably get a better sense when we discuss the presentation, is that it tries to address that widening schism between the 2 countries, which is Bharat and India. Bharat, which bears the climate impact, and India, which imposes it, the shining and the suffering India, as is often called. And that is then compensated for by India towards that Bharat. The level of the calculation that we have done requires the carbon tax for this policy to be implemented to about $60.4 US per metric ton of carbon dioxide. As a result of which the electricity prices would go up by 25 percentage points. So from 0.08 to 0.1, this is in US dollars. The cutoff level of energy, as I said, is given by the 7th decile, that is given by the CIQ, the Climate Injustice Quotient. That gives you universal access to energy. Anybody who consumes above that limit doesn't get that free. So that is a disincentive to be consuming more than that free limit. The free entitlement as a result of this is about 189 kilowatt hour per month, which is per person. So which translates into 412 kilowatt hour per year by the average size of household. This is for the household, it's 189 kilowatt hour per month. So every household gets 189 kilowatt hour per month free of cost as a result of this policy. In terms of transportation, the travel passes, as I said, it's the 7th decile, which is the cutoff for us. So that's about $18. I know it's really peanuts. It's not really a large amount, but that's what the NSS data shows, that this is the amount that the 7th decile in India actually spends annually for transport. It should be much higher, but since it depends on the data that we have, so we've just included that as somebody who, as the amount that universally everybody gets as travel passes. As a result of this, you have the following benefits that you get as a result of this policy. The numbers are very small, so I need to explain them a bit. And this is, as I said, I'm going to end in a slide more. So I still have 4 or 5 minutes. So if you look at this table, what we have done here is looked at, as I said, each of these deciles that you have in the commodities that they consume, there's going to be a carbon charge in each of these commodities. So we have clubbed all of that together. How much are they going to pay? So the lowest, the poorest decile is going to pay $20 US as carbon charge because the prices would have risen for the commodities that they would be consuming. And the richest 10% pay a carbon charge, which is 7 times higher, which is 143.1. All of this is annual. Now, obviously, if we were to leave it like that, then you can see that the poor would be suffering more, because if you look at the carbon charge as a proportion of their total expense, then obviously this number that you see here, carbon charge in terms of the proportion of your expense, is the highest for the poorest decile and lower for the richest. So they will be paying more if you were to purely just have a carbon charge, not in absolute terms, but in shares. If instead you actually have this transfer in kind in the form of electricity and cooking and transport, then you get a benefit as a result of this policy. So you add these two up, 17.9, as we said, universally for all, and electricity and cooking in terms of every household, they get a certain amount, which is given here. The numbers vary because the numbers of households, the number of people in the household vary, the size of household varies. That's why this number is varying here. If you add these two up, that's the energy benefit you get, and you subtract the benefit, the charge from the benefit. This is the net benefit you get. This is inverting essentially that injustice funnel. The richest 3 decile of the population give from their pocket the benefits that the bottom 70% of the population gets. And in terms of the net benefit as a share of their expense, you can see that that climate injustice funnel has indeed been inverted, that the top is paying for the bottom 70%, and the maximum benefit goes to the poorest in this population. This is the last slide and I'll be done. What are the benefits of this program? Every household in India will have access to electricity. It can happen both from grid and non-grid, a feat that almost all governments have tried but never managed, despite the claims to the contrary by our current Prime Minister that it has reached every village and every home, everybody knows what the truth of that is. It also delivers, which we have not covered here, more employment, the discussion that we have been having with Naga for quite some time. The fear in the fossil fuel industry that employment is going to get affected with this whole transition bit. It's actually not true. Yes, it will affect employment in the fossil fuel sector, but not so much in India because it's not an absolute decline. But more importantly, the greener forms of energy are more employment intensive. We have worked on that in another paper. And hence any transition actually increases employment, let alone decreasing it. Higher prices of fossil fuel, because it increases the prices of commodities, induces the rich to move towards greener forms of energy. It also induces the poor to move away from traditional forms of energy in terms of wood or cow dung or other forms which are health-wise not very good. And they move away from that to this form of energy. And they do so because they don't have anything to lose. The price of the energy that they're currently consuming is zero, and as is the price of the energy that is being distributed to them. So if you were to collect wood, that doesn't cost you anything, it's free of cost, but you spend a lot of time on it. Here you get cleaner energy free of cost. So that transition would also be made at that level. Availability of free energy also addresses the issue of stealing of electricity, because this is a question which came up time and again whenever we presented it, that giving anything free creates problems, so on and so forth. But it also addresses other things. In this case, there will be no incentive to steal electricity if you get a certain proportion for free. The last, which is the most important in the current context, is the health impact of air pollution in India, which has been estimated to be about 3% of India's annual GDP. And indoor air pollution adds significantly to that. And our number of deaths, as you can see, is the second highest in the world after China. Policies such as these can help address that as well. So it's not just an advantage in monetary terms, but also in its health impacts. That's all from my side. We would love to have questions and discussions from you. Thank you for patiently listening.
Thank you, Rohit. Thanks a lot. Maybe you can get off your share screen, yes. And also just turn on your computer a little so you can see your, yeah, that's better. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thanks again, Rohit. Thank you so much. I'd asked Rohit to keep it sort of lucid so non-economists and sort of others like us, who are lay people, could understand. I think Rohit has succeeded admirably. Thanks. Also, it's very fascinating because, like I was saying earlier, to the best of my knowledge, there is no country in the world, either in terms of the volume of emissions that are as large as India's, or in terms of the proportion of carbon taxes that it imposes on carbon dioxide, just significant. And I think that Rohit and Shouvik's proposal, in a sense, is probably among the first that actually combines the two for a country with as significant emissions like India, which is roughly 2.6 billion tons of CO2 and probably 3.5 billion tons if it includes methane and other. Rohit, one clarification before I open it out. And when I open it out, Shouvik, I'd like you to come in as well as a co-author, where you can turn on your video and audio. One clarification, Rohit and Shouvik, as an effect of your policies, you had in a slide of how that would reduce potential carbon emissions from India. Could you just sort of elaborate that again? As a consequence of what you're suggesting, how would it lower India's potential emissions of carbon dioxide? And after you respond, let's open it out and you can respond to the questions with that. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, so Shouvik, do you want to answer or should I?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of you're asking how would this policy change the emissions for India? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So basically, if per unit of GDP, the amount of energy that is used in producing 1 unit of GDP, if that changes, if the energy composition changes in favor of low emitting energy technologies, then that's what would bring the emissions down per capita. We are not saying the absolute emissions would necessarily come down, because there's also going to be growth in the economy. So, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, Shouvik has assumed, Shouvik and Pauline have assumed a rate of growth of about 6% in GDP for the next 20 years. If the rate of growth is lower, then obviously the emissions would also be correspondingly lower. But the point here, and which is where the green growth comes in, that one is, even if the economy were to grow at a certain percent, you can still have policy which can keep emissions, the rate at which it is growing, under limit. And that's what that chart, if I can go back to, if you give me 2 minutes, because that's one chart which explains, yeah, this one. So this, oh, but you can't see. Can you?
No.
You can't see. Wait, just a second. Let me keep that thing on anyway, because it's easier. Where is it going? Yes. So this is it visible? I think it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where the total energy consumption would have come down because of the energy savings, which is to the extent of 30.9. So if you were to continue the way you're continuing, and with 6% rate of growth, this is the emissions that you would have with the current technology. If, however, you were to implement this policy, then the amount of energy required would go down by 30.9 QBTUs. And the way it would go down is essentially in terms of the clean renewables and total consumption that would through energy savings, if I'm not mistaken. And since it is
it's actually at that row down below, we talked of total CO2 emissions that I was asking. Yeah, at 4.72
yeah, this
billion.
one, right? So this then is 36.8 multiplied by the per unit emission. So that's how this 2.2 billion tons has come. Just as 67.7 multiplied by what 1 QBTU produces, you have 4.7 billion tons. So just that, I mean, simple arithmetic, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But Shouvik can come in if I made a mistake there. So, and then it brings the per capita emissions down from 3.1 to 1.5. Yeah.
So there are also some questions in the chat box. Again, people are requested to type in their comments, responses in the chat box. But if anybody wants to prefer to just speak up and ask both Rohit and Shouvik, please feel free. All right. Otherwise, you all can go through the questions. I need not actually repeat them. You can see them right there, Rohit, Shouvik.
Yes.
Questions from Simran about an additional 1.5% of GDP is required as public expenditure for energy transition. Does it also include private investments? Shouvik, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah. Hi, Simran. Thanks for your question. It's actually the total investment which we are talking about here. And this total investment, how we determined was by looking at the levelized cost of electricity that is required and converting it into capital investment for each technology like solar, wind, geothermal, and all these technologies, and trying to find out that how much India needs to spend annually to develop that technology or to implement that technology across the country so that we can achieve these targets. And there we are talking about this 1.5% of the gross domestic product, which includes both private and public investment. So we are not taking any position as such in that regard that it necessarily has to be only public investment. It can be either public or private or a combination of both. So yes, it is not only not the only public investment, but total investment in general. Yeah, you can go.
Like to go down the questions yourselves instead of my reading it out. Then Barbara has both a comment and also in a sense a question that you all can respond to. One, how does one map it on to current government policy? Have other countries set it in motion? How do you, and in particular, I think this question is important. How do you deal with the illegal economy? Something that she had presented the last time, particularly for coal, given that a very large section of sort of coal mining is in the informal economy, as she had talked.
Rohit, want to respond
about that? Barbara, would you like to? Are you able to see the question?
Hello.
Yeah, hi Barbara, please.
Rohit, I have written my question and I think Nagaraj read it out correctly.
Yeah. So
it's a very sensible policy, but how does it map onto Government of India policy cravings? I'm always looking for obstacles and enemies of sensible suggestions. Yeah, because unless we mainstream those obstacles, they will set in motion politics which will make a sensible suggestion like this one more difficult to implement. So that's what's behind my questions. And the illegal economy of coal, well, coal India thinks it's 5%, but the police in Jharkhand say it's between 25 and 50%. It's enormous. And why? Because so many brick kilns, small workshops, dyeing, chemical works aren't registered to get access to coal legally, as it were, through the policy system. So they get it on the black market. And it's those kinds of questions that I sit here in Oxford wondering about.
No, I may not have all the answers, but I think with the current government, anyway, the expectations are not that much. I mean, they are interested in various other things and not necessarily environment. So, so we don't really know in that sense whether the current government would be interested in any such policy. At the same time, I would just like to add that as far as the there is some enthusiasm on solar, whatever may be the reason for it, that the government has invested in, not to the extent that it should have, but there is some. So it's a possibility that I mean, any government would have to engage with, if not now, definitely much later before it's too late, to be thinking on these lines. If not tax, then do it from the government fiscal side itself. But if nothing is done, then obviously things would be pretty bad. But as far as the illegal economy is concerned, well, that is a tough nut to crack at any point in time. I mean, informal economy, or not informal economy, but illegal economy of what is done in terms of stealing and evading regulation. We still think that if you were to put a price on something, then that's something that cannot be necessarily evaded. I mean, you can evade a regulation, but you can't evade if you, let's say, are mining X amount or whatever is being mined. Yes, you can steal there, but whatever price is to be imposed there, it's imposed in at the level, at the entry itself. So I understand that if there is a large proportion which is essentially just illegal mining, then it may not fall in this bracket. At the same time, when it enters the market, it will have to be, whenever it is used in production, it will be competing against other commodities. So in that sense, there will be some balancing. There will still be an increase in prices, but not as much as what we are proposing, somewhere as an average of the two, where you have free illegal coal coming in and the high-priced coal coming in, because there will still be demand. All of it is not illegal, in which case there will be a broad average between the two. So you will have to, if any such policy has to be effective, to also simultaneously attack such stealing. But that's something that any policy would have to perhaps deal with. I don't know, I'm sure I haven't answered, but what can one do in situations such as these, that these are problems that we are afflicted with in general for an economy such as ours. But tax will definitely percolate down to commodities, maybe not to the same levels as we have calculated in such a case, but still.
Should we add to that? Otherwise, Prakash wanted to come in.
So let's hear what Prakash has to say, and then
Prakash, want to go in?
Other questions. So you're saying Prakash wants to respond to this.
No, I have a question. Hi,
yes,
Rohit.
yes.
Shouvik, thank you for a wonderful talk and great work. So I had a quick clarification. You said something about the top 10% in India, and you quickly mentioned that the super rich are not included or something like that.
Yes.
So
yes.
that's one small point of clarification. But my question is to sort of follow up on Barbara's question. And, you know, I think Barbara asked this as a political economy question and you responded as such. My question would be that, you know, just as Barbara mentioned, let's assume that we are not going to have revolutionary transformations in how policy works in India. And the situation remains as discussed in the last question. Can we find a methodology to do some kind of economic modeling, which will tell us that, you know, you put in these taxes, but then there is certain amount of stealing, certain amount of evasion and all of that. And so in that context, what is the net benefit? And then we can compare these kinds of policy options to some other kinds of policy options, for example.
Yeah. So
that's about it.
Okay. So let me respond to that. So, for example, as I said, of course, I mean, none of these policies can be foolproof. I mean, not just in India, anywhere else as well, but countries like ours face particularly those problems more than others. But let's say any tax, I mean, for example, the tax that is put on fuel, customs duty, I mean, many indirect taxes that we already pay for. So it's not as if that these taxes don't exist and are not used. I mean, fiscal policy is all about those taxes, right? So money that is spent on NREGA, money that is spent on public health, on public education, all of that is after all managed by taxes. So it's not, in that sense, nothing new. It's just that the form of tax is different. Now you can say that those taxes are also misused, and they are indeed. At the same time, one would not turn around and say that then those taxes have not been used at all. You see the cost benefit of that. Those taxes, which are commodity-based taxes, direct income taxes, or in our case, there could be wealth taxes. These taxes play a role, a redistributive role, if they were to be implemented in the way that we are proposing. So I mean, tax per se is not all unmanageable. I mean, every economy has taxes. This is just an additional tax which is put on carbon. And in that sense, that is the uniqueness of this. Any other policy, I mean, I'm sure, of course, there will be other policy alternatives as well, but I am not too sure that for this reason, because there could be these problems with tax evasion and things like those, that one cannot have a policy, because that way then any public policy would be difficult to implement. So I would not worry on that count. On other counts, yes, in terms of stealing and all of that. But as I said, that's a problem that is generally a a problem with any policy in India. I mean, which doesn't mean that we don't implement policies. So it depends. I mean, if it is too high a tax and the benefits don't accrue at all, which I don't see happening. I mean, for example, electricity that is supplied to households, if it is free, it is free. I mean, Delhi government, when it did 200 units of free, everybody gets that free. So in terms of the benefits accruing to people, it can be formulated in a different way to include others who are otherwise left behind, and one can do those details. But most redistributive policies, when they are universal, then they have far, so for example, PDS, sorry for a digression, but targeted versus universal PDS is exactly that everybody has access to that ration. So same thing here, if everybody has access to, and that access has to be provided from this infrastructural expenditure that we were talking about. So you need to create that infrastructure, and then this policy follows. I agree that it might be easier to do it in a city first and then think of a countrywide thing. That may be a better way of approaching this, but that it will create that bigger problem roadblock that the policy itself will be unimplementable, perhaps is, I don't see.
Rohit, if I could clarify, the question was not about the unimplementable policy. I said, let's assume that we want to implement this policy. And the question is, do we have a methodology to account for the inefficiency of policy?
Yeah, so in that, one can only do an alternative policy scenario. So let's say if there is policy A and B, and we look at the inefficiencies that would arise in both these policies, and then do a cost benefit analysis. Right. So for example, if you were to do some other policy, you may have leakages there as well. I mean, one doesn't know. I mean, one policy may have certain kind of leakages, some other policy may have some other kind of leakages. Then you have to look at the relative benefits that the two provide, and then choose between the two. So unless there is an alternative which is provided to this, it is very difficult to talk about the net loss to compare against.
And just to add to what Rohit said, Prakash Shouvik here, actually there is it's also response to Barbara's question that there has not been really much experiment on this, except in the case of British Columbia, where they did it and they found that what they did was they redistributed the money in the form of checks, like dividends, cash dividends to every household. But that we thought, like Rohit was saying, that in terms of cash, it might, for a developing country like India, it might have a lot of problems. So we thought that it would be better to stick to kinds, like benefits in the form of kinds and redistributing. Now, I think your point is absolutely valid. Like it might have leakages, or it might have the taxes might not be able to be mobilized because of, like Barbara was saying, because of the informal economy that exists or illegal economy that exists in the coal mines and all. But as Rohit was pointing out, this criticism will hold for any tax. Like, even the sales tax, people say that we don't have, the grocery stores don't give pakka receipts and all that. They just write on a paper. Sometimes you don't even have receipts. But that doesn't say that one should not argue for, especially this kind of taxes today, the environmental taxes and all, which is immediately required, not only, as we showed, like not only in terms of like for the environmental purpose or the ecological purpose, but also for this growing inequality that is happening in India, and in controlling that. So yes, your point is obviously well taken. Like there is an informal economy, there is an illegal economy, there will be leakages, but that would happen with any other taxes also, we guess.
Right. Yeah, to conclude this in one sentence, I think the question is not either or. My question is basically to point to ways in which your policy proposals can be made more practical. And I think, I think we can have more discussions about that. But I was not at all saying, this is not an either or situation. Okay, and I think Barbara, Barbara also was mentioning the same kind of question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Carry
the
on
next,
yeah,
there are so one question by Shivani. I think the
read it out, will
so
you?
Simran has investment priorities for the proposed required for energy transition. So I think this perhaps Shouvik has answered in the public versus private investment, or did you not?
Yes, I did.
If you did not, Shouvik?
Yes, I did. The public private.
Then the next question is about rebound effect. I mean, I'm sure Shouvik will come in, but just a quick thing. The rebound effect in this case is not necessarily true, because you actually have a price rise also taking place. So it's a combination of quantity that that you're getting, and also a price rise that is taking place for the rest of the community. That's one. Number two, we are saying that this is done for commodities which are produced with greener technologies progressively. So in that sense, the rebound effect, even if the demand rises, if at all it does, although prices will control for that, but even if the demand rises and it is rising through production of greener forms of technology, then there may not be a rebound effect in terms of emissions. There might be a rebound effect in terms of consumption, but not necessarily emissions. So I don't know if I've answered that, but if Shouvik wants to pitch in, he could. Yeah.
No,
so the next, Shouvik has answered that bit.
Simran has a question below.
Shivani, I just wanted to respond to one question that Shivani had about competitiveness. And I think that's a very important point. Rohit, you want to go, or I just...
you carry, go ahead, I'll see.
Yes, I saw that.
Simran's question, which is input cost will impact so Indian products in
Simran's question.
Global market.
Increase in
links to jobs and livelihood.
Please. Yeah. Shouvik, go ahead.
Yeah, Simran, you are correct. Like, it's true that if India does it and no other country follows it, then of course it would, in this global world of competitiveness, where every country is trying to do export promotion to capture the global market, it would definitely increase the cost of production and might make India less competitive. But here, let me tell you an interesting observation. Like like European Union today is formulating a trade policy where they want to actively promote trade from those countries which are promoting sustainability, is taking steps to mitigate emissions and environment, because this has come up as a big point that many countries like China and especially is like the global production house, where the consumption is happening in the advanced countries, but the production is happening in the south. So it's appearing as if the south is the polluter, but they are producing actually for the consumption of the global north. So at least in the European Union and others are having this. Did I lose? So there is a discussion there there is at least in the policy circle, this is coming in, that trade policies has to be formulated in a way that those countries which are taking measures for sustainability and protecting their environment needs to be encouraged in the trade deals. Like you get some, it's still under discussion, but you get some extra points or you get some extra advantage because you are actively in the national level policy taking those decisions. So, of course, you are right that it might make India, in that sense, uncompetitive in terms of increased cost of production. But at the same time, given that the worldview and these things are coming into the policy prerogatives of the advanced countries, India might turn out to be in an advantageous position if they take these measures of promoting environmental regulations and improving their ecology and reducing carbon dioxide, and might help in the promotion of their export and might help in the creation of more jobs rather than losing jobs.
Prabhu had
I was just going to respond to that. So how will this change with changing composition of consumption?
oh, Prabhu, yeah.
So
before
He also had an
that,
observation about
sorry,
the
sir, that's, I could formulate that as a question. Sorry, may
Yeah,
just Rohit and Shouvik, I was just worried about your assumption, which is that the level of inequality remains the same. Is there an impact of this on the level of inequality of consumption, for instance? Or I couldn't understand it properly, perhaps, because it's very, very neat and well done. But I was wondering if the initial conditions are the same as at the end. So let me formulate it like that. Is a better way, so if inequality has an impact on the carbon emission, suppose let's say that the carbon emission is a function of inequality, let's say.
Yeah.
If it is is it better to tackle inequality in order to, it's an old question, but I'm just saying it's the way you formulate. You started by saying this is the old redistributive versus growth and all. Here you are assuming growth. So all the things are there. You are putting up growth, but is your carbon tax actually a better way of attacking inequality?
So to
both of the consumption and carbon.
That is a similar question.
Yes.
Which since you're doing two things, your carbon tax is effective at redistributing energy consumption and the costs and benefits of energy consumption, but precisely because you're changing the energy mix and doing a partial decoupling in actual profits and income, the other end of what you're doing is potentially leading to income inequalities can rise together with energy inequalities being redistributed more evenly through this carbon tax mechanism.
Yeah, so the possibility, it's a possible thing. You have to show that it does. Yeah, agree.
So the trade-off between these two is not, that is to say the larger equity concerns are not necessarily addressed, though a much narrower set of energy inequity concerns might. And I have a few questions about that, but I'll ask that later. But just because it went there.
Yeah, so two things. Number one, it's true that that the future consumption expenditure obviously can't be taken into account because number one, economists are very bad forecasters, so they should never forecast. So the current, what we have taken is basically the current expenditure, and that's how it can. That's the only possibility you have in terms of calculation. And this is, you can think of it as a policy conversation starter. Just as, let's say, when you had NREGA, there was a number which was thrown that you give these many days of employment on a certain wage. Obviously, you didn't know the future, at what rate inflation would take place, so on and so forth. So it's just an initial, let's say, discussion starter. It doesn't include the change in inequality that would be taking place in the future because it can't. At the same time, it does not mean that this policy, by its, at least this policy on its own, I'm not saying either of you are saying it, that it increases, it will lead to inequality because of this policy. It addresses carbon inequality immediately, but on its own, absolutely correct. It does not change the income distribution or the system itself. There's no doubt about that. I mean, a carbon tax policy on its own doesn't change the structure of capitalism. I mean, we are not thinking that.
No. But there are different structures of capitalism with different levels of inequality.
Yes.
So it's not that. So are we saying that we'll remain at this same level of whatever? Okay, capitalism, rakho, no revolution, but capitalism with this level of inequality.
No, just a second. Let me finish. If you
Can
have
I come in here? Can I come in here? If I just come in here briefly, I don't think that one should expect that a carbon tax will address broader levels of inequality. I don't think that's its purpose. I think a carbon tax is certain, at least in my understanding. The authors may not necessarily agree with me. Like I said earlier, there is no country which has a carbon tax that is either sufficiently high. For instance, Canada's is like $20 or some such thing of carbon per ton of carbon dioxide. Japan, like I said earlier, covers 1 billion tons of CO2, but its tax is $3 per ton of CO2. So I don't think the purpose of a carbon tax is to address a broader inequality which is deeply structural. I think it has a frame in which it addresses a certain transition. I think that's what, the way I understand the presentation, the way I understand the carbon tax is what I think one needs to look for. But that's just my take on the matter.
Yeah,
I have some further comments that will go to that, but I'll come in later. Sorry.
No, so I'll just address. I mean, I'll just respond to. I completely agree with Naga that the purpose of this paper is not to solve all the problems, and obviously the claim perhaps got miscommunicated. What we are trying to say is that it also partially addresses inequality. So if you have consumption inequality which rises, then the taxes also would rise and rise much faster because the composition of consumption of the rich in favor of carbon emitting commodities is much higher. So inequality, inbuilt inequality is also simultaneously getting reversed. For the simple reason, as I said, if they fly more, they pay more taxes, and hence you have a higher tax revenue which can be redistributed in the form that we have suggested, or for a faster energy transition. Yes, it does not obviously address the inequality, the structural inequality which is part of the system, but then for that, there are other policies which one can discuss and has been discussed. It requires political will. But for example, wealth tax, inheritance tax, there are many things which can easily be implemented in a country like ours, and which can directly address the issue of inequality within this system. Those have to be complemented with this. This essentially addresses carbon inequality, but also I would say addresses inequality partially, as I mentioned. So if consumption inequality rises, the taxes would also rise against the rich in this proposal, because it's not a per unit tax. It's what they call ad valorem. It's basically a tax which depends on the commodity that you consume. And in all likelihood, the richer you are, the higher is the carbon content of the commodity you consume. So higher the inequality, higher is the tax you pay.
I'm going to move on to the next question by Sagar, if I haven't missed one. A question that I think he had asked earlier. He says we need to reduce emissions at a global level, that is, by 7.6% per annum over the next decade, to have a chance to remain below 1.5 degrees Celsius of average warming. If your method was adopted globally, how would it help to do this?
So Sagar, we have a paper on global emissions as well, on similar lines, but actually that's very different. There, we are arguing for far more a radical proposal than this, where we are distributing economies in a similar manner with the climate injustice funnel, where not only do the richer, the global north countries control for their emissions, it's all utopian in some way, but then it's a better alternative to carbon trading. We have prepared a paper on that as well, a similar model, but at a global level, with the difference that they pay not only for their transition of the kind that you were saying, but also pay partially for the global south, depending on how far away from that average you are. So not exactly in the same form of this paper, but yes, there is a global proposal as well. In which case the reduction would take place with much higher, obviously much higher taxes in the global north. It's another matter that will not be implemented, but I mean, in an academic exercise, you're trying to push the frontiers of what can be done. After all, it's not stopping. I mean, despite all the discussions around it. So our idea is if we can start locally and see and show the success of such a redistributive policy in emissions as well. I mean, British Columbia, as Shouvik said, is a good example of that. Then perhaps one can generate some discussion around it. Yeah. Shouvik, you want to come in?
Can I just intervene and add to, this whole thing? Right now, there is a $1.4 trillion investment happening in fossil fuels globally. And what I see happening, and I've written about this, is basically there is a Jevons paradox in play. That is, while capacity in renewables is going up, capacity in fossil fuels is also going up. And
right.
I don't see any way in which basically what you have proposed, if I've understood you correctly, and please forgive me, I'm not an economist. I come from a science background. Is what you have basically proposed is a demand side management, which already, to me at least, seems to have failed. And again, I've written about this earlier. And I think the only thing that's going to work is supply side management. But how really to get this done is something that not only beats me, but beats a lot of people I sort of keep talking to and so on and so forth. So I don't really see, for example, how CNG can replace, let's say, coal. Because CNG itself has certain limits in terms of it's going to last only about 50 or 60 years. What are you going to replace CNG with then? There are, I think, far more interesting things that are happening around the world. And one of them, actually, the long-term solution in part lies in biomass. And that is something that I don't know why people don't really look at seriously. And if you look at countries like Cambodia or Laos or for that matter of fact, Sri Lanka, they're far more dependent on biomass than, for example, India is. And if you look at Sri Lanka's HDI, no matter how not so good an index it is 60 ranks above India. And there are good reasons why. It has a lot to do with, for example, their lower level of urbanization. The fact that you do lesser energy conversions in biomass, and the fact that, and therefore, thermodynamically, it's a more efficient fuel as compared to, for example, fossil fuels. You suggested electricity. Actually, electricity is not as good a fuel or as good a source of energy as, for example, coal is. Because in electricity, you put out, in India, for example, double the amount of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour delivered as compared to coal. So electricity is not necessarily the best option in this whole thing. Not particularly if it's a grid intensive kind of a situation that we have. So I think there are several other things that we need to really look at other than just the economics of this whole thing. Though I found your lecture extremely educative, and I learned quite a few new things, which I must say very thank you to you for. But I would submit to you that I think we need to look at a much more all-round, this whole problem in a much more all-rounded way as to how to beat the 1.5 degrees Celsius curve, warming kind of a temperature thing that we need to do. How are we really going to do that? Because that's the main problem. And what is the alternative really to fossil fuels?
Thanks, Agar. Actually, even though in this paper, demand is something, so because the tax has become the core of this paper, the paper that I was referring to by Shouvik and Pauline actually addressed the bit that you just mentioned in terms of both biomass, in terms of bioenergy, and other options of this transition. So they're not talking only about, let's say, CNG, but they're talking about an exhaust. So since that paper is already there, that's not the paper we presented here. We took that as a given. Maybe I should have done the presentation slightly differently. But the supply side measures that you're talking about for in the Indian case, they've presented a detailed proposal on that. I mean, the investment that is required for it and the energy transition that this would entail. So that's a paper we would recommend you to probably to also look at and see if we can have a discussion around it. When I said demand side, I was merely mentioning the pricing bit. Of course, there is the other side of changing the underlying production system itself, because if you don't do that, in the long run, you are essentially not going to change the emissions all that much. So in that sense, one can say that carbon tax is more a short to medium term policy. What is far more important is changing the underlying energy mix of the economy and making that transition without doubt being the most important. About capping and taxing, that's a debate which has been there, that if you cap the carbon emission itself, then let the markets decide its price, in which case at least the emission has been taken care of, is also something which has, although it's more, it is more effective, but it's something which I don't think any country has managed to. A lot of such proposals have come, but no country has actually managed to cap the emissions through permits. Even the carbon trading system has actually, at the global level, has pretty much failed. So the issue is, how do we go from here to there? Do we straight away go for radical options of capping, or do we do something which can make us go from here to there? It's the movement from the short to the medium where taxes help, not a long-term solution for sure.
Vandana and Shivani have, I think, similar questions. Rohit and Shouvik. Vandana says, I second Shivani's question. What will it take, additional to this approach, to achieve the Paris targets? Would you feel you've responded to that? Or would you like to take that on?
I think Anish had another question which I just saw. A quick answer to that perhaps we have answered, but developed countries would have to have a different policy altogether. Then you look at the global targets that each of these countries would have to commit to, which would require them to have a far more radical climate change policy than the global south. So yeah, it will not be the same.
Sagar has a further question. What energy resource do you want to replace fossil fuels with? Are any of the alternatives technically viable? Which ones? Do they have resource constraints? Sagar, do you want to sort of clarify and amplify this?
Yeah, because but it's not really the topic that they were talking about. So it's a question really as to do we stop at trying to replace coal or something of that sort with or oil with CNG, or do we go beyond it? But if the topic is really to discuss carbon tax and what role it can play in order to reduce emission, then let's restrict the discussion to that and not, digress into.
Okay, I was just trying to do justice to your questions, yeah. But
I just,
response to your point about biomass. One is that India's emissions from biomass is huge. It's actually 800 million tons of carbon dioxide from biomass, and I think it's large.
No.
Indonesia. One sec. It's one of the three large countries along with Indonesia and Brazil, and it also has very clear health implications with the way in which how biomass is burnt and used for cooking indoors, and as you know full well. So when you say that we need to actually expand our proportion of biomass use, what do you have in mind, and what are the ecological implications of that? And secondly, how?
Okay, you see, actually, biomass and the use of biomass as a fuel is really part of the whole problem of using solar energy as a source, right? Because essentially the three kinds of
Be brief
technologies
because
that
I think we are stepping away slightly from the main presentation. So respond.
Yeah, I'll be very brief about it. See, actually, I just took a look at the biomass percentage just 2 days back, and it has not decreased substantially in the last 20 years in India. It's come down from about 23% to about 18%, 19 to 18, between 18 and 19%. Now, actually, biomass technologies which can give you clean fuels have not been encouraged, not only in this country, even outside this country, by and large. And I think that is what we need to do, because that is the resource that we are going to stay with for a long time. There are, of course, other issues like deforestation and so on. I won't get into all those kind of issues right now. But my own take on this whole thing is it is not PV panels alone or PV technology alone, because even in PV, there are certain issues like where are you going to get the tellurium from in due course, or chromium from, which is going to make thin film PV panels, because they're going to be in short supply in about 30 to 40 years or so. It's biomass technologies which are going to stay with us for a very long time if we develop them. The kind of engines that are required, the kind of fuel processing that is required to make it into a clean fuel. And for some reason, this has been completely neglected globally, by and large. Let me just add to it very quickly. See, the number of energy conversions you have in biomass, which is a ubiquitous fuel, is far less. So if you look at what is called the well-to-wheel efficiency of biomass, it's much more than what fossil fuels give you because of the lesser number of energy conversions. And this is the point that goes into the making why Sri Lanka, in fact, which is far more dependent on biomass than we are, has been able to do much better than what we have been able to do. More than 60 ranks above us in terms of HDI. I've had the opportunity to, make these talks to their ministers, to their secretaries and so on in Colombo, and they agree to this logic. And yet somehow they get converted into getting pulled by, somehow we need to go the software way that India is going and so on and so forth. We need to very seriously look at biomass and how to make it an important resource and make it clean, make it available to everybody.
I have.
Please.
Can I just respond to? So this paper is not only on carbon tax. I mean, I probably went. I mean, the pendulum swung the other way. It's not only on carbon tax. It is trying to address both. We're just saying that the supply side bit has already been taken care of in another paper. So it's a continuation, assuming that that paper, the bit that they have discussed there, has been already addressed. So one should read perhaps these two papers in combination.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd love to read them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll make sure we get them to you, Sagar.
Yeah, Anish wanted to ask another question.
Yeah, please. Yes.
Yeah.
Anish, can you come in?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for the paper. It was really interesting. And so I had a question actually about two cases that would obviously be on people's mind with the way in which you've designed it. And really, it's a question about the design of the demand side, as you're putting it, which is that if we think about Delhi and the electricity experiment.
Hello.
The electricity experiment. Hello.
Prabhu, just can you mute your mic, please? Anish is speaking.
Prabhu should mute his mic.
So the electricity experiment actually had some perverse distributional consequences in as much as renters often end up getting these fake meters that landlords are charging fairly high rates at, continue to charge fairly high rates at, while landlords are getting the benefit of the subsidy in as much as it operates, right? So in fact, for quite a large section of the city, the price being paid for electricity is actually not the major benefit as compared to, for instance, building out a infrastructure for health in the form of mohalla clinics, which has, I think, reached a lot more people. So there's the Delhi side of things, which suggests that even on the demand side, just simply looking at price mechanisms around energy might have some peculiar distributional consequences or unexpected distributional consequences, not because of theft, not because of other things, but simply because of the structure of power relations and the actual existing this thing. I will come to sort of tie some of these threads together at the end. The other case, of course, would be France and the Gilets jaunes movement. And the yellow jackets are, of course, the poor, but they're the suburban, rural poor who are at the receiving end of a carbon tax on their vehicles and so on. Now, the problem that strikes me there and how it relates to your demand side approach is that the reason, even if you were to offer the benefit that you're offering to these people, which is a travel pass for transport, which was the main concern, it wouldn't help because there isn't a transport network in those areas, right? In fact, on the question of buses in Delhi, there's an analogous problem in as much as precisely because while you're making bus travel free, you're not increasing the number of buses in the way in which you need to. You're creating more problems, and the redistributional consequences, in fact, become perverse in as much as some of the people who are away from transport networks will not get the benefits of your travel pass in a way that people who are in cities, for instance, in this case, will get much more of a benefit from the travel pass because of the ways in which the travel network itself is built. The thing that ties it up really is that you've chosen to make the demand side purely a question of returning in kind, but in kind only in the form of an energy return, right? Why not think in terms of a Green New Deal kind of an approach? Why not talk about building out mass housing? Why not talk about actively building out transport in that sense? Because these strike me as better ways to return the subsidy to the poor that also take care of some of the other sort of larger inequalities that you're talking about, inequalities of consumption and so on, by asking for a collectivization.
Yeah, so Shouvik may also want to come in, but a response from my side that this proposal itself is not just, the benefits that you can announce can go beyond these two or probably at the cost of these two. What one is arguing is basically a return in kind and not in cash for the usual reasons that has been discussed in the case of India about kind versus cash. So in kind, so for example, it could be done through rations, it could be done through other means as well. There's no doubt that the extent of its coverage can go beyond this or probably at the cost of this. The reason why we have picked energy in particular in this case is because the effect of the indoor air pollution or the medical effect of that is also there on the rural households, on the poor people of this country, and that's happening because of the traditional forms of cooking that they have to depend on, and this is perhaps a response to that. Yes, it will have to be different for rural versus urban, but they're not mutually exclusive. For example, when you said public transport, the supply side is essentially addressing that you increase, because just having a pass does not help. You need to have increased number of buses, even for a city like Delhi. So those are the expenditures which are included in this 1.5% that we were talking about. So it's and think of it for 20 years. So this is a possibility. It can be done. It's not a one-year expenditure that one is talking about. So public transport infrastructure itself can be changed during this process, which is part of the supply side measures. As I said, this presentation addressed the demand side more than the other side. So perhaps that balance got tilted towards the demand side alone. Anish, to the other suggestions that I said, I mean, you can include other commodities as well, and perhaps commodities which are more inclusive, which may not have as much of a leakage, or as you correctly said, in the case of electricity, it's the benefit which is going to the landlords and not necessarily to those who rent these houses. So yes, it can be expanded beyond energy itself. The only difference is that it will increase the prices even more. And if you were to substitute it in any other form, even then it may have higher prices. But I have no quarrel on in terms of what other commodity can be included, or probably excluded, excluding this and including some other commodities. So that is something which is definitely workable. And in fact, we are thinking on those lines for another paper that we are writing. But
Simran has a question at the end, and sorry, Vishwa, you want to say any further?
Yeah,
Prabhu, just before you do, unless you're responding to this specific one, Simran has a question at the end, and then maybe Prabhu. Simran has said a question above. Simran, would you like to come in and actually convey your question? Is she there?
Yeah, so I think she's talking about priorities for public investment, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this kind of a transition can't be made exclusively on private investment to begin with, for the simple reason that private investment is driven by profits. And if the government were to guarantee it or underwrite those investments, then you'll essentially end up in what we are, which is my field of research, the NPAs in the banks. I mean, this is exactly the model that both the UPA and the Modi government has followed, which is of PPP, that government doesn't take the responsibility. It provides land, it provides credit, it provides all kinds of things, but government itself is not involved in any of these investments. And when they go bad, they are the ones who take the load of taking all these losses that the corporates make. So there's no doubt that it should be public investment driven. At the same time, you can also have incentives for private investment in these areas, because at the end of the day, they are going to benefit from these energy transitions. I mean, there is a limit to fossil fuels, and at some point that transition, before it's too late, will have to be made. So it needs to be a combination, but without doubt, it has to be led by public investment. It can't be a private investment based thing, because then it will take years, probably decades, for it to come into being.
Yeah. Prabhu, please come in.
No, yes. Actually, it's a follow-up. I had written about it. I had written in the chat box, but I can't get through to the chat. I don't know why. So I had written in the chat saying, does your model assume that the distribution of the composition of the consumption remains the same? That means, would the poorer, as it grows with growth, would the poorer shift from less energy intensive to more energy intensive commodities? If they do that, what happens to your model? That's the broader thing. That's a specific question I wanted. Are you assuming that the level of whatever is similar, or the consumption composition remains the same over these 20 years? Or,
No.
and I think also
the consumption composition would change without doubt, except that
would it change your model? Would it change anything?
No, it would
I
definitely.
was just wondering what effect it would have in your calculation.
Yeah, it will change the levels of taxes, but actually for the same transition, the taxes would become less, for the simple reason that if I move towards more carbon emitting commodities, then I need less per unit tax to make the same policy, right? So in that sense, if anything, the taxes would actually come down if you move more towards carbon emitting techniques, because you will pay more taxes, right? But more importantly, we are saying that you're making two things at the same time. Number one, even if the energy, even if the consumption composition changes, which it will, because if you become richer, the composition of your food basket changes. Every commodity, because of the underlying energy the energy technology itself changes, the energy structure itself changes of production, then for every commodity, the emissions would have, per unit emission would have come down. That was that table which Pauline and let's say you fly, you use more transport and instead of bicycle, the emissions that is coming out of let's say the public transport would also gradually be declining over a period of time. So that is taking that into account, assuming at a macro level how this will get redistributed at an individual decile level. It's very difficult to say because there's no way you can predict the consumption basket, even next year. Forget about 10 years down the line. So what can you at best do? You take the macro data, and at the macro level, what can you say about emissions? And then you can say that even if the composition were to change, it percolates down commodity-wise to every commodity, right? So if the emissions, if the economy becomes twice efficient in terms of emissions, so your emissions go down by half to produce the same commodity, then across the board, the emissions would have gone down, right? Even if the composition changes.
Per unit.
Per unit, yes. It is per unit.
Anyway, it's a total thing which you are calculating, no? Total reduction.
No, so, as I said, that the total thing is the emissions that includes the growth in GDP.
Yes.
So you are taking into account the cake increasing, but the way this cake is baked, that technology is changing. So you're including both these processes. We are not saying cake remains the same. Cake expands, but it uses less and less of flour and less of electricity to bake it. If that is the case, then the total emissions, obviously they absolutely grow, but they don't grow at the rate that they are growing currently. The emissions are going to grow. In developing world, to expect the emissions to absolutely decline is a far cry, in my opinion.
No.
And in that sense, it's unfair.
So that 67 to 31, what was that? Total, or was it?
31 is total, is absolute.
So would that not change? If you change your composition, would that not change? 67 to 31, you are assuming similar.
Sorry?
Would it not change? So it will be less, actually, you will reduce. If the consumption changes towards more energy intensive and including and assuming similar distribution, and the composition changes towards more energy intensive consumption, would not, sorry.
Yeah, so okay, I got your point. Yeah, maybe Shouvik also. Yeah.
Just a couple of points, Prabhu. You're right. Like there might be an increase in there will be, in fact, an increase in energy intensive consumption because when you provide free electricity, people's energy consumption will go up. But there are 2 points here. One is that, and like Rohit said, that assuming a 6% growth rate, it would be that we are not talking about that the economy needs to contract, that the size of the cake will increase. But 2 points. One is that in that investment strategy, that's why he was referring to that 2015 paper, there is a 1.5% GDP expenditure in 2 fronts. One is to improve the energy
infrastructure.
Yes, one is to change the improve the energy efficiency. I'm sorry. So I'm sorry.
Energy intensive consumption.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. He just opened it.
No, don't be sorry.
It's absolutely fine.
So,
don't be sorry.
So what happens is when your energy, you're investing in energy efficiency, so a major investment happens in this front. So that's the energy saving part which we are discussing, which helps in improving the energy efficiency in the economy, that 31 cubic meters of energy, because you are spending the 0.5% of the GDP on that. And will it not, like someone raised this question, I think probably Shivani, that won't it create rebound effects? Yes, it will. There will be some rebound effects to it, no doubt. Like there will be increase in energy intensity. So at the same time, that's why we are emphasizing on the other 1% of the GDP, which is changing the composition of the energy itself towards more of renewable energy. So as the energy intensive consumption which goes up, yes, it goes up, but it goes up in favor of the renewable energy consumption, like through solar, because there is a, we have to remember that carbon tax, there is a relatively the price of fossil fuels will go up tremendously high compared to clean energy. So the price will also act as a disincentive for your consumption of fossil fuels. So there will be among the richer households, there will be a price like a substitution effect towards towards renewable energy. So one thing which is happening with the 6% growth rate is energy consumption will go up. The energy consumption will go up, and that's why this is a follow-up paper, that the energy consumption will go up in the economy.
Favor.
But yes,
In favor of more
renewable energy, and there will be also an energy savings part which comes to the energy efficiency investments.
Yeah, you mentioned that. All right, but it's
Prabhu,
still,
can I just come in?
Briefly, Rohit, we need to, I think, wind up briefly.
Very briefly, the methodology that we have used is input-output. You're right. If you were to do a more exhaustive kind of, I mean, there is a substitute for that, which is in taking demand and supply elasticities into account, which will address the issue that you are raising. But there are also methodological problems with that, which perhaps can address the point you are raising, which is correct, that if there is an energy change in energy of the poor, consumption basket doesn't remain the same, it changes. And that is not something which can be taken into a static analysis. So it needs a dynamic analysis. There's no doubt about that. It has its own limitations for other reasons. So there are two ways in which it can be done. Some people have done the other as well, where they take those things into account. But those are, details where much is lost, not so much gained. So it depends on, a cost benefit in terms of methodology. That's it.
Okay, I need to sit in his chair. In case someone has something very urgent to say, speak up now. Otherwise, I would wind up. And thank Rohit and Shouvik for a most
thank you.
And also simply opening out enabled extremely rich discussion. It touched on just so many things, and that's partly the purpose of these presentations. To also present something lucidly to non-specialists and also sort of show the connections of different things that connect with the climate crisis. And Rohit, thank you very much. There are a lot of issues I think that we can take forward, which also Barbara raised and many others did, which I think we can take forward in discussions and conversations. I hope all of you put your emails in the chat box, and we hope to continue with these presentations every once in 2 weeks. Any teachers, activists, and students among you, we are open. So do get in touch at our email address, which is teachers@climatecrisis@gmail.com. And thank you very much for making the time today. Thanks again, Rohit and Shouvik. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
For hosting the
Thank
meeting.
you. That was really illuminating. And I appreciate the patience of, and the dedication of people. This was such a wonderful discussion. I hate to put an end to it. But
thank you, Vandana.
Across the 2-hour mark, yay us.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Stay in touch.
See you in the next meeting.
And do all of you put your emails in the chat box so that we make sure we review our
We'll
next
be in
meeting.
touch. And yes, thank you very much. And I'm going to just, as a precaution, take a quick copy of the chat box, just in case, so that I have people's emails, and I'm going to wrap it up. So thank you again, everyone, and especially to Rohit
and to Shouvik. We'll see you next time when Naga is going to be speaking, I do believe. All right, folks, take care.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye.